All right. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about understanding your soil test part 3, and we're going to be looking at soluble salts on the Ward Labs S4 soil test report. I'm Ashley Hammac, and I'm with Ward Labs, and this is kind of my start over. Can I start all over? Start all over.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Ashley Hammac. I'm with Ward Labs. I'm going to be talking to you today about understanding your soil test report. This is the third part in a series of understanding your soil test report presentations. We're doing short presentations to go through each part of the Ward Lab soil test report. Today we'll be talking about soluble salts. Okay, so we're going to brief overview here. We're going to be talking about what are soluble salts, how do they affect plants and soil, how do you correct a problem of having too many soluble salts in your soil, and then also how to look at your soil test report and determine how the importance of it and whether or not it's something that you need to be concerned with. Okay, so when people think of salt, they usually think of sodium chloride, but in reality, salt is a general term that applies to cation-anion pairs. They exist as cation-anion pairs as a solid. You put them in pure water, they dissociate completely and are highly soluble. So they become invisible, and in a pure water, the water would continue to be colorless. So this is what a salt is. When a solution is saturated with salts, with dissolved salts, it can't hold anymore. No more salt can be dissolved, and so additional salt that's added will not dissolve, and you will have solid falling to the bottom of the solution, and that's precipitate. Okay, so soluble salts can be in a lot of different forms. In cations, we can have a list here. This is not exhaustive, but covers most of them that you would potentially see, and the anions. Okay, and so for many of these, what do you see when you see this list of cations and anions that form salts? Well, for most of them, they're nutrients. So really, when you have an excess of soluble salts, you have a too much of a good thing. So when it comes to how it affects the osmoregulation of plants. So when there's excess salt in the soil, the plant responds by trying to equilibrate that difference in salt concentration. So the plant has a low salt concentration inside the cell, and there's a high concentration in the soil solution. So water moves from the cell to the soil solution in an effort to make that concentration balanced, to make it equivalent. And so you get water moving through the membrane out of the cell and into the soil solution when you have excess salt. And so that basically is, you're dehydrating the plant. You're pulling water out of the plant so that this equilibrium can be reestablished based on the concentration of salt in the soil and in the cell. So this, in this picture here, this is what is indicative of a high salt concentration in the soil. So you would see water movement out of the cell, and that would be hypertonic. And in an isotonic, which is a balanced osmosis situation, you have the same amount of water moving into the cell as moving out of the cell. So there's no imbalance in salt concentration in this situation. Now, in this situation, you have more salt in the cell than you have outside of the cell, and that can cause a hypotonic situation, and the cells would pull more water into the cell. Now, this is a thing that can happen as well, not as much of an issue as when it's hypertonic. And what happens when cells, in mass become hypertonic? Well, they wilt, and then at high enough concentration, they'll die. And this is obviously not good for crop growth, not good for any kind of plant growth. Soluble salts are, the way we used to measure it, we would extract, take water, extract this, shake it with the soil, and then take the water out, and then dry the water off. And what was left behind is the soluble salts. Well, we don't do it that way anymore, but we still call it soluble salts. We now measure soluble salts using an electrical conductivity meter, which the units for that are that we use are millimos per centimeter. Okay, so this is an interesting story behind these units. Mos are the units for conductivity, and interestingly, it's the conductivity is the inverse of resistance, and the units for resistance are ohms. I think ohms was named after a person, but since someone, obviously very creative, said, well, if ohm is for resistance, then conductivity, which is the inverse of resistance, should be mos, spelled backwards, ohm spelled backwards. So anyway, so if anybody has any better ideas for a unit name for conductivity, I'm all ears. Okay, so now in the soil, when we measure the electrical conductivity and we get a value of 4 millimos per centimeter or above, that's indicative of a saline soil. Saline meaning salty. And you're going to experience detrimental effect to your crop unless you're growing a tolerant species, which there are some, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But you want to pay attention to that number 4 millimos and keep it below that if you're trying to grow normal crops. And really, you want to stay well below 4, because you could start seeing some signs even below that in some of the more sensitive species. How do saline soils develop? Well, in arid areas, semi-arid and arid areas, it's oftentimes naturally occurring. You don't get enough rainfall to flush the salts out of the surface, out of the soil profile. So when water runs into the area or the salts are brought up through the groundwater, they kind of accumulate because there's more evaporation than there is leaching. And so that's how you get natural, really anytime, whether it's naturally occurring or not, you develop saline conditions when the amount of water that's percolating down through the profile is less than the amount that is evaporating or transpiring out of the top. You can also develop saline soils with using salty irrigation water. So it's very important to keep tabs on your irrigation water quality. Fertilizer application, particularly if you're applying micronutrients, you might, you got to be careful and just not apply too much. If you're applying based on what the crop need is, then you won't ever develop a saline soil from fertilizer application, because the crop is removing it as you're putting it down. High water table is another way that saline soils can develop. Whenever the natural vegetation is removed and you either don't put any vegetation back or you start cropping it, then the water table can rise and bring salts up to the top, where evaporation then removes the fresh water and leaves the salt behind. So can form in different ways. There's really, when it comes to remediating it, there's really only limited options you have. So first and foremost, I would say monitor your soil test, your soil with soil testing. Monitor your irrigation water if you're irrigating. And what I keep hammering this as much as I can. What I really like to see is people looking at trends, not just one soil test or one water test would be fine, but monitoring soils takes more of looking at trends than looking at one particular soil test. So watch your soluble salts. If they start creeping up, then you need to address it. Address it before it becomes a problem. Before you get to 4, start looking at some options for getting it back down. Okay. So first thing, look at your irrigation water, know what you're putting on, know what you've got in your soil. So the 2 options for remediating saline soils are to either leach the salts out of the root zone. You can do that with irrigation water. If your irrigation water is low enough in salts to do that and to grow a crop, you have to have good quality, or decent quality irrigation water to do that. You can, leach the salts out of the root zone, basically by applying more water than what the plant can take up, so that the excess water pushes the salts out the bottom. And a way to facilitate the leaching is to build organic matter. Building organic matter helps aggregation. Aggregation helps drainage. You want to improve your drainage so that you can leach those salts out. Also, soil disturbance is going to hamper drainage, and so when you till, you're decreasing the amount of percolation you get, and you're increasing the amount of surface water runoff that you get. So think about minimizing the disturbance. And then, if you can't leach it out of the root zone, then you got to remove it using a plant. A plant has to remove it for you. If you get up into that 4 millimole per centimeter range, then you're going to have to start looking at tolerant species. Barley is one, cotton, and these others, in horticultural settings can be used. Most of the crops that people are growing, row crops, are going to fall in that moderately or sensitive range. Unfortunately, soybeans, are somewhat sensitive. Corn and wheat are somewhat moderately tolerant, but that 4 millimoles range is where you want to kind of avoid building up to. And then when I say use a tolerant species to remove the salt, you can't just, you got to cut it and take it away, and then make sure that what you're putting back, you're not just replacing the salt that you just removed. You're giving the plant what it needs but minimizing the amount of things that it doesn't need, because those other things that it doesn't need are going to accumulate as salts. Okay, so now on the soil test report, here's the analyte we're looking at. Soluble salts 1:1 means one gram of soil per gram of water, and then we measure millimoles per centimeter. This is well below in the safe zone, so we are not in trouble here. And there's actually, we don't have a recommendation line for whenever the soluble salts get up high, but if it does get up high, you might see like a note down at the bottom saying your soil salinity is getting high. You need to take, measures to address this. Okay, now soluble salts or salinity kind of goes hand in hand with sodium. And I probably should talk about sodium more today. I'm not really going to talk about sodium as much, but oftentimes a salinity problem and a sodicity or a sodium problem develop simultaneously. Now, if you can have a salinity and a sodicity problem, you can have only a salinity problem, and you can have only a sodicity problem. So salinity is more of an issue for plant health in terms of like plant physiology. What's the salt doing to the roots? Sodicity is more of a soil structure problem. So if you get high sodium where and low calcium magnesium levels in the soil, you can get a soil issue called dispersion, where the clay particles will actually be repelled by one another, and you get this dispersion of clay particles, and then kind of it just gets really bad, very difficult to remediate once you get into you get a dispersed soil. But basically you got to draw down the sodium, replace the sodium with calcium and magnesium, but once you get that dispersed soil, it's a long process to remediate it fully, and you just don't want to get there. So if you got questions about sodium, I'm not going to talk any more about sodium today, and I'm about wrapped up with the soluble salts too. But if you've got questions on that really you really are urgent for you, feel free to give us a call. We can talk more about it, but I will address sodium later in one of the later parts. So with that, I'm going to close. Be sure and look on our website for the Ward Guide. There's a lot of useful information in there, including a lot of information about salinity and sodicity, as well as other really beneficial information for you. Also, be sure to follow us on social media. And with that, I don't think we're live, so I can't take questions, but if you have any questions, feel free to send them our way, and we'll get back to you and answer those questions just as soon as we can. Thank you.